Hello, and welcome to the Wade Borth podcast. I'm your host, Wade Borth, and in every episode, my goal is to get you to think differently about how money works and ultimately to empower you to take control of your money and your personal financing system. Hello, and welcome back to the Wade Borth podcast. Today, I have a special friend of mine, a great friend of mine, Monty Flack. Monty and I met, probably a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and Monty and I were recently down at an IBC think tank, the annual users meeting or annual meeting for IBC practitioners. And while we were there and having lunch together and enjoying each other's company and having great conversation, Monty was sharing with me a great story to drive home the point of what we do and how important this industry, the life insurance industry, is in people's lives. Now, so before I get started, thank you, Monty. Appreciate it. Maybe give them a little bit of an insight of who you are and where you're at right now and the fact that you work for Factum Financial. Go ahead and give me a quick bio if you don't mind.
Thank you, Wade. I appreciate the opportunity. I got started in life insurance in 2009 by getting my first policy. I went to work for a gentleman, my mentor, taught me the ins and outs of infinite banking. In 2018, another practitioner and I started Factum Financial. And since then, just spreading the word, the truth of finances and helping as many people as we possibly can.
Yeah. You're out of the, Phoenix area, or it's not even Phoenix, it's South Phoenix, right?
We're actually it's called the East Valley, where our office is in Mesa, Arizona.
Oh, that's correct, Mesa.
Yeah. And you'll be out here next month to visit us here.
Yes. Looking forward to that visit. It's going to be a lot of fun. Now, some of the things that the listeners, obviously, that may or may not know you have a couple of interesting talents. One is that you used to teach, but you also used to teach in Spanish. So you offer the IBC course in Spanish. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was a high school Spanish teacher for 14 years. And that's when I came across, and then obviously things transpired from there. But yeah, we have another practitioner here in our office who's actually from Colombia. And so he's the main person because it's his native language to do an IBC course in Spanish. So we do carry cases of books, the IBC book, Becoming Your Own Banker in Spanish, because being here in the Southwest, we have a huge population of Spanish speakers. In fact, we belong to the East Valley Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, just for that reason.
Interesting. And do you see that there's again, just for our listeners, both Monty and I obviously were practitioners of Nelson Nash Institute and IBC practitioners. So we have a belief of taking control of the banking function in your life. And about that control brings that freedom, right? So the freedom of money, time, relationship, and purpose. And when we understand what's going on in the financing world, the most important thing we can do is focus on the right thing, which isn't the rate of return on our separate investments, but more importantly, taking control of the function of interest paid to some other institution, and then having that flow back to our institution. And so that's one of the things that, from just our common background in IBC that we both believe in. What would you say from the Hispanic population? Is that as big an interest as it is, and maybe just what I would say the non-Hispanic population? I see different segments, and some of the people want that control because they don't want to be beholden to somebody else. And so I'm just curious what your feeling is on that.
My feeling with the Hispanic culture, community, and this is just knowing because my mother's first language was Spanish, and just understanding how a lot of things were done, it's pay cash. A lot of it is just pay cash.
Pay cash.
That way we don't worry about having to go get qualified for a loan, anything else. Let's save, let's pay cash. And therefore, we give up the interest that money could have earned.
So they're a step closer than the traditional, what I'd call the traditional American, right? If you look at how much debt the traditional American carries, they're probably one step better, but they're not the best step. Would that be fair to say?
That is fair to say, because if you take a look at Nelson's annual pattern of spending, he's giving Americans credit of saving 10%, which we know the savings rate in America is 5 or below. In the Hispanic culture community, the majority are saving a minimum of 10%, because even with that, even if they're not going out and buying vehicles and such, they're sending a lot of that money back to their family back home.
Yeah. Obviously, and the tool that we use is, we call it a properly structured life insurance policy, whole life insurance policy, right? where we try to minimize the death benefit, we maximize the cash accumulation inside that policy. That's our natural fallback position in the IBC community. And we don't necessarily always appreciate that death benefit portion of our policies. Maybe we do, but a lot of times we don't talk about it. Would that be fair to say?
I think early on in my career, that was so true. I think just at the stage of life I'm at now, it's become more of a topic, but wholeheartedly, even still, we design those policies for the banking function, minimizing the death benefit and increasing the cash value, just like you said. But in my world, I'm in the process of finishing up another policy on me, and the majority of it is for the benefit part. I designed this policy a little differently to give me a little more benefit, but also give me a place to store more.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction is a lot of times we will talk about the cash and the cash accumulation. And it's not that the death benefit, it's just a different conversation because, that's an event sometime in the future that we have to prepare and we have to plan for. And then the infinite banking idea gives us between now and then, what are we doing with our money? So it gives us a warehouse to store our dollars. So sometimes we don't talk about the death benefit as much. And that was actually the story that I'm going to ask you to share here in a second. Is how important that death benefit is. You made the comment to me that you can't finance a funeral, and that hit home. I've delivered a number of claims in my 30 plus years of being in the insurance, and I've lived through my own family where I've had family members where I've delivered death claims and not delivered death claims. And I can tell you, just from a personal note, how big a difference that made. I will tell you right now that no matter how much I wrote for and how big the policy was, it was never too much. I never had somebody tell me to take it back because that's just too much. And then the other side of the equation is we're the only one we're the industry. And I think the industry kind of gets a raw deal and maybe rightfully, but we're the only industry that comes to a funeral bearing a check. And it's a fabulous, great industry that when you, again, take the lifespan, right? So we're gonna do infinite banking between now and when you die, and we're gonna make sure that you take control of the banking function of your life. That's really important. And then when you do die, there's this fabulous thing. We all have to graduate from this world, like Nelson would say. And then when that happens, what kind of legacy are we leaving behind? Maybe you want to just talk to that real quick.
I appreciate that, Wade, because in my years of being in the insurance industry, I have not had to deliver a claim this far. But
you will.
I'm sure. I wish back in 2003 somebody had come to visit me to deliver a claims check. My stepfather had just passed away, August of 2003. And you got to remember this time. You had all these exotic mortgages. In fact, he was diagnosed with cancer. And because of his agent being a business person, he didn't have insurance. So the house was paid in full. It was clear. He refinanced it in 2002, 2003. You could do 125% loan to value.
Oh.
So he did that. And he used it to pay for his cancer treatments. My mother didn't know that he did that. And my mother had her health issues at the time. And so he passes, and I was left dealing with the responsibility of planning his services and going through all his financial statements. Come to find out, I looked everywhere for some type of life insurance, and I figured the type of man he was, he would have that in place, but I could not find it. So I'm at the funeral home planning his services, and I thought, because I was a school teacher at the time, and back then my contract, the yearly contract, was just $26,000 a year, and which wasn't much. I was living paycheck to paycheck as it was. And so I'm sitting there making the funeral arrangements, and I asked, okay, how can I finance this? And they told me, oh, no, you cannot finance this. It must be paid in full before we have the services. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Because my mother was on disability. That was only $400 and some a month. My father's Social Security check had just come in the day after he died.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this was all an awakening for me. I thought, well, I'll cash it and it can help pay for the services. And no, exactly. I didn't know. I was told, if you cash that, the IRS is coming after you. the government would be coming after you because he's already dead and you're cashing a check that was dated after the death. So I was blessed at the time that I was already teaching. I was doing after school activities, so I was double dipping a little there. It wasn't much. But the beginning of August of that year, I was blessed to take on another position. I became a dorm director for the community college there in my hometown. So they gave me a place to live, and it just so happened to be after I left the funeral home trying to figure out, okay, I got to put everything on pause. I grew up Catholic, so typically you try to have the funeral within 3 to 4 days after one's passing. But because I haven't paid for the funeral yet, I had to delay everything. I had to keep pushing back. And because I had this other position, this other job, they just happened to pay me. And they paid me for the semester in full, which was a great surprise. So now I had enough money to go pay for the funeral. And I thought to myself, and this might sound a little morbid, but as a funeral home, why wouldn't they finance a funeral? What collateral do they have?
What are they going to do? Dig your body up, Monty? If
yeah,
bills are paid?
Take everything back. But the sad note about it is the whole time why trying to honor my stepfather, it is my stepfather for 28, 29 years. So he was a father, not a stepfather, right? Trying to honor him, but everything came back to cost because I could not finance it. I had to go as cheap of a service as possible. That means instead of a nice coffin, it was a wooden box. Instead of taking it from the mortuary to a service, to a church, so we could have a church service, every time you transport the body, price goes up. And at that time, if I remember correctly, it was $800 every time they had to move them.
Back in 2003, right?
2003.
Yeah.
And okay, we can't do that. Take that off the list. Take that off the list. So it was a very generic service, and it still cost me $4,500. So at that time, I thought to myself, my gosh, I could never, I was single at the time, but I said, I couldn't do this to my family. There's got to be some measure to prevent this. A year and 3 months later, my mother passes. I already knew you could not finance a funeral. And I was still trying to recover from paying for my dad. $4,000 when you're taking home probably $18,000, that's a big blow. And fortunately, shortly after that, I was introduced to infinite banking. And like you were talking about prior, start putting my money to work where I could access it and pay off some other things so I can recapture a lot of that money. But the thing is when I did get married, it was an intricate part of just our daily finances, running things through our banking policies. But now that I'm getting older, it's an important part to leave that benefit so my family never has to worry about finance.
Yeah. That's a powerful story. And just that thought of, I've never had the thought. My father died when I was 13 years old, left my mother with a ton of debt on the farm, but really no cash flow. It put her in an awful position, but I'd never, ever thought of in the position you were in and the fact that they don't finance funerals, which if you think about it, it obviously makes sense. Just a quick side note to that. Years ago, we went to Salzburg, Austria, and we ate in the catacombs. There's a restaurant right next to the catacombs in Salzburg. And to that point, if the family you had to pay to have your loved ones buried, whatever it's called, put in a catacomb there in the hillside. And if you didn't pay the bill on an annual basis, then they would dig your ancestors up and they'd put them out in Pauper's Field. So it's a whole other discussion. But just the thought of that, I mean, it's amazing that a lot of people don't think that. They they don't finance a funeral. And I just man, that strikes such a chord. And that's just one thing, right? That's just one thing that happened at the time of your dad's death, your father's death. I'm going to call him your father because he sounds like he was more of a father than a stepfather. He was there for you and raised you. But that's just one thing, right? How many other things were affected by that. I look at like when my father passed away, and just on a quick side note, the banker had convinced him to drop his term insurance about 6 months before he died, because we had a note at the bank on our form, because that was a cost item, that was expensive. And so what are all the other things? That's just one small example.
Yeah. And what's the compound effect from, like you said, from all that? It wasn't just that we couldn't finance the funeral, because, like I said, he refinanced the house 125% loan to value.
Right.
For some that don't understand what that means, let's say the house is worth $100,000, they're going to lend him $125,000. That's what was happening in the early 2000s. I don't know. All that went to his cancer treatments. Because of that, none of the money was going to pay the mortgage. So on top of having to pay for his funeral, the house was in foreclosure now. By the time I got through all the paperwork, now what am I going to do? I'm dealing with paying for a funeral and figuring out how my mother's going to live, which is a whole nother story.
Right. On $28,000 a year on your salary.
Yes. And her disability is $400. Yeah. How am I going to make that work? But the power in that, and in everything that happens, I take a step back and take a look at it. And I think Nelson talks about taking a step back and taking a look at the big picture. You know what to do. It led me on my financial education, which has led me to where I'm at today. Had those things not happened in the way they happened, I'd probably still be teaching and living just a paycheck to paycheck still, because that's what you do as a teacher, and happy to have the summers off.
Yeah, that a buddy of mine, Don Blanton, one of his phrases is that life insurance is the language of love. Yep. You have to have somebody that you love and don't want to put in a bad position. Even though, and I've heard, just being in this business long enough, you talk to a lot of different people, just put me in a pine box, right? I don't need a funeral, whatever it is, right? That whole thought process, that's great for you, but for the loved ones that you leave behind, you Monty, think about that. Even if your father would have said that to you, it still put that amount of stress on you. You probably would have went through even more stress if that's would have been his wishes, right? Because you wanted to honor him and you wanted to do what was right by him. So it is truly a language of love, the whole insurance contract idea, because what we're doing is we're insuring a life and your ability to earn income, but we're also preparing and providing a pool of money at the time that somebody needs it the most. And if you're 80 years old or 90 years old, you might think, well, I don't really need it the most. Well, somebody is going to need that, right? And why not use a discounted dollar? Why not use to buy $1 worth of benefits that's going to cost you a whole lot less so why not buy it at a discount versus having to pay a dollar for dollar expense like you had to do? Because that's in essence what the funeral home is telling you, Monty, is that you can't finance this. We need $1 for every $1 worth of benefit they provide. And so
that's very well put, Wade.
Yeah, thank you. I have a little bit of nuggets of wisdom that pop up every once in a while when I get rambling on, but it is a truly, and that's just, again, that's one small example. And so, again, I get passionate about IBC. I get passionate about taking control of the banking function of life, but I'm also very passionate the product that we use, that we strongly use, and that it's a different conversation, but it's just as important of a conversation. Yeah. And then when the insurance company comes to you and says, hey, you're worth $3 million, the question I like to ask is, what do you think you're worth? Because that's the legacy you're going to lead. And for people that get IBC, especially in a family situation, what better legacy can you leave than the knowledge on how to use it, plus the funding that goes along with it and the death benefit side of it? I'm not afraid to die. I mean, I'm going to meet my maker, and hopefully I've led a good life, and I'll be with my friends and family that have passed away. And I believe that's going to happen. We all have to graduate from this world, like Nelson says. So the question is, what are we doing to leave that legacy? Do we want to leave that legacy, or do we want to leave a bill that you have to try and figure out how to finance, and they're telling you that you can't finance it?
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And the thing is, with infinite banking, being good stewards of our money, we're actually leaving a double legacy. It's not just the money that we're leaving, but we're leaving them the knowledge. And that's where the power is. Now that they have the knowledge, they know what to do with that money. Because it's very interesting. As a former school teacher, I knew we had group insurance. And in my group insurance, I had a $10,000 group death benefit. I was talking to the superintendent of the school I used to teach at a couple weeks ago, because the cost of everything, that group insurance is now $20,000 for death benefit, because you can't die for $5,000 to $10,000 anymore. It's more than that. And I can imagine even doing it as inexpensive as I did, the wooden box, having the service there at the mortuary, and having just one trip from there to the cemetery still costs $4,500. What is that today?
Yeah, 10 grand.
10 minimum. So with that, with infinite banking and the legacy is, okay, learning how to be a good steward of my money, where to put it, where am I saving, warehousing my money? Oh, and dividend paying whole life insurance policy structured for this process. Educating my family on that, so when I do graduate, this windfall, they know, obviously they have more than enough money to pay for the funeral, but they know how to put it back to work.
Right. That knowledge is crucial. And we're doing it right, we're not going to have 125% loan to value to our asset, because at the end of the day, I will be leaving assuming that I graduate first, my wife and my son with no debt. And how huge is that, right? Because that debt will be paid for at that event.
Yes.
And then the knowledge on what to do with the rest of those dollars. So one thing, if you had one thing to share with your father, if you could have spoke to him maybe 5 years before he got his cancer, what would you have said to him? You ever give that some thought? Maybe it was meant to be, right? So maybe you wouldn't have changed anything. I think that's what you said earlier.
Had things been different, would I be where I'm at today? And my belief is things happen for us, not to us. Because of that, it put me in a position where other families do not have to struggle or go through what we went through. That through my knowledge and my experience, I can help avoid that process. And especially in today's world with social media, you see GoFundMe pages quite often, which just tells you that this problem is happening. It's more problematic than we actually probably realize.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't want to say it drives me crazy. It disappoints me, I guess, a little bit that there's these GoFundMe pages when there's especially somebody younger that's dying. From our industry as a whole, we have a failure because we haven't reached these people. I guess that's probably what drives me and makes me real passionate about just the life insurance side of it, not just IBC, but the life insurance side of it too, is because I see that as a failure. The amount of people that have been asked or had a conversation around life insurance is small. We think everybody's been approached, or we've seen it on TV, or we've had ads pop up on Facebook about life insurance policies, but nobody's having a conversation with them. And it's hard. I mean, you think about it. If nobody brings it up in conversation, why should you do it just because somebody says you should? It goes back to that whole adage of, unless I know, why should I do it? Why do I want to take that treatment? Because I don't know what the issue is. And that's hopefully what we can do with this podcast. Your story is share with them. It's not, and again, it's not just about the funeral. It's just about everything else, right? The idea that you can't finance a funeral is what was hitting me in the head when we were talking. But it's so much more and so much deeper than that. But the point is, are we having those conversations? And are people, the general public, open to having those conversations? I think they are. I really believe they are. I mean, I really believe if people, again, it goes back to what Nelson says, if people know what's going on, they'll know what to do. But I think a lot of times people don't understand the why. Why should they have that coverage? What benefit is that to them? And until we can have a conversation and educate them, I guess I don't cast stones to that people. I guess I cast stones more to our industry because we're not doing a better job of reaching out and contacting people.
That's a very good point. You mentioned that the story isn't about the funeral.
No.
The funeral's just a symptom. What is actually the disease is the education that's going on there. And you said the industry's not doing a very good job of reaching out and educating. But who is educating them properly or touching the masses better than life insurance is about their money? And it's typically Wall Street, right?
Yeah.
It's very interesting that I will encounter people and talk to them about where they're putting their money. And it's, my 401k. And they tell me all the reasons why. What else do you know about it? Nothing. Why do you do it? Because they told me I'm supposed to. Here's this process where you can take control of the banking function, keep more of the money in your family, and then plus you can leave a legacy for your family. Oh, I don't need it.
Yeah.
Oh, very interesting. So it's what mainstream is talking about compared to what needs to be talked about.
Oh, complete dichotomy, completely different.
Because you've heard the expression before that it takes twice as long to tell the truth than it does to tell a lie.
Yeah.
And I think Todd Langford even said it takes a chapter to tell the truth to correct a one-line lie. And that's what's happening. But I think in today's world right now, more and more people are open to listening to that.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree with that. I see it more and more. I get more people getting involved in this conversation at a lot deeper level. And I think my comment is that the insurance industry hasn't done a great job. Maybe that's, but ultimately, who's responsible, Monty, for your life and your expenses and your finances and your education? Who's responsible for that?
Living in the greatest country, it tells me in the Bible I'm responsible for my actions, and the Constitution tells us that we're responsible for our actions. So therefore, that falls on me.
And I think, like you said, it's really, if we're doing a great job, the industry can be of great service to the individual. If we do a proper job of, again, having that conversation with them, the client being open to that conversation and not being conditioned to think a certain way because somebody on Wall Street wants all their money and they're afraid a dime might leak somewhere else. I think that's part of it. So, and I truly see it really in the generations coming up, and really there's a lot of people in the older generations too, that they're not taking all of this as the words are spoken to them. They're questioning the concept very boldly, right? So they're asking tough questions and they're finding out that, hey, there is a better way. And I think, again, what we do, at least in my mind, with what both you and I do, is we take this idea, I've said this before, we take this idea of taking control of the banking function in your life. That's a process. It's not a product. Then we marry this great, fabulous product called dividend-paying whole life insurance. We structure it correctly. So now we can take control of that banking function from now until the day we graduate. And then that product, the properly structured dividend-paying whole life insurance, pays off at the very last day that we're on this earth. And so now we're talking a process from today until then that takes care of us from all the way along the way. Again, it's a great, fabulous tool, but it's just a tool we have to have an understanding on how to use it. And I think that's where us as practitioners can come along. And that's why I think we've made a lot of inroads, because a lot of people want to understand that craftsmanship and that mastery.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to simplification.
Yeah.
Simplify the process, because obviously you've been doing it for quite a while. I've been doing it for 13 years now. It seems very natural to me. But it is a paradigm shift at first because of what you are programmed with about how money should work, put your money in a bank, et cetera, all that good stuff. And it's just making that little shift, taking a step back and looking at things and making that little adjustment. As they said at Think Tank, rethink your thinking is all it is.
Well, Monty, thank you for sharing that story. Thank you for the conversation. It is a story to be told. And again, it's not something that a lot of people want to talk about because they don't want to think about their own mortality. But ignoring it doesn't make it go away.
It's funny that I have this conversation with my wife. And I said, if I go first, you know what you're supposed to do, right? And she says, talk to Kyle. He already knows how this is all supposed to go. And then I make the little joke, look, sat at my funeral, and then enjoy yourself.
You said look sad at your funeral? Is that what you said?
I looked at my funeral. But,
yeah, we have something very similar. My wife, I said, if I graduate before she does, right now, I said, go contact Mary Jo, who both know, and then go forth and prosper. It's a thought process, right? And so the running joke, whenever we're out doing something, we'll look at each other and say, is your premium paid? And maybe that's just an inside insurance joke, but that's how we approach it, is like, as long as that premium's paid and as long as that thing is enforced, it gives you a sense of freedom.
And it's funny that we joke like this with our spouses, because I tell Kyle's wife all the time, if something happens to Kyle, I'm selling you all base. You know that.
Selling what? I'm sorry.
I'm selling you all base.
Oh, I'm selling you a bigger policy. Exactly right.
So see all base. Just a little inside joke.
All right. Again, thank you so much, Monty. I appreciate it. So for the people listening, it's Monty Flack. He's with Factum Financial. He's an IBC practitioner out of Mesa, Arizona, and he's truly a good friend of mine. And his story carries a lot of power and a lot of weight all kidding aside, and it's just something I'd ask people to think about, because it's important to have a conversation. It is important to think about. And just because we don't have that conversation, we all die. And so you can either choose to be proactive about it, or you can be reactive about it. So again, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye. If you're enjoying this podcast or know anyone else that might be interested, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and please leave a review. This will help this podcast reach and help more people by ranking higher in searches, and ultimately help more people get out of financial bondage. And don't be afraid to share this podcast with your friends and family, as we can be easily found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.